I'm Rob Forsyth, and welcome to Liberalism in Question, a series of podcasts from us at the Centre for Independent Studies. We look at issues facing the world today from the point of view of classical liberalism, its strengths, its weaknesses, its opportunities, and its challenges. And today I'm joined by Bob Catley. Bob Catley is the author of many books. He is a retired member of the House of Representatives for the Labor Party. He's been involved also in Professor of the School of Management many years ago at the University of Newcastle, and he joins me. Bob, welcome.
My pleasure.
The reason that I've asked Bob to join us is because of this book that I found at the CIS. It's called The Strange, Recent, but Understandable Triumph of Liberalism in Australia. And Bob tells me that is not his head on the front of the cover. The thing about the book is it does tell the story, a very full story, of the rise of liberalism, particularly economic liberalism, in Australian history, culminating with what we will call the Hawke, Keating, Costello, Howard days. The book is published May 2005. That is nearly 20 years ago. So I want to talk to Bob about why he regarded liberalism as having triumphed, why it was strange but understandable, particularly what his view is of what's happened in the last 20 years and what he thinks the future may hold. Firstly, Bob, why was the triumph of liberalism in Australia both strange and yet, from your point of view, understandable?
Well, it was strange because after Federation in 1901, state interventionism in Australia was the typical policy formulation of governments, both right and left. And the state steadily expanded into various areas of economic and social activity, most quickly under Labor regimes, but also under the Liberals. And this then became a difficult policy act to maintain somewhere in the late 1970s because stagflation set in, and people generally on both sides of politics thought that the way to escape the stagflation of the period was to liberalise the economy.
Stagflation being, am I correct, high inflation and high unemployment?
Yeah, it was a stagnant economy and rampant inflation of prices. And this was unsustainable. Now, people on both sides of politics came to that conclusion, including on the right, if you like, John Howard as Treasurer, but he was stopped from doing anything about it by Fraser, who maintained a statist perspective. And on the left of politics, the Labor Party, surprisingly perhaps, Hawke and Keating took up the Liberal mantra and pursued it in the 1980s. Now, I'd been a leftist critique of this in the 1970s, so I didn't come to it early, I came to it late, and concluded after a couple of years that Hawke and Keating were right, that there was no other way to get out of the stagflation crisis for Australia other than liberalising its economy and getting it more efficient. So that was pursued in the 1980s. I went into Parliament in 1990 and enthusiastically joined that policy orientation. There was then some hesitation under Keating, who as Treasurer had been a wonderful liberaliser, but as Prime Minister backtracked in various ways. But he was defeated in 96, and the Liberals, who were now led by Howard, who was a liberaliser from the 1980s, indeed from the late 70s, he and Costello set about pursuing further liberalisation and pursued what I thought was the correct policy orientation, while Labor floundered a bit under a variety of leaders. So when I wrote in 2004, the study that came out in 2005, essentially I thought Costello and Howard were on the right track, and I was recommending to my remaining colleagues in the Labor Party that they drop the hesitations and go back to where Keating and Hawke had been, that is, trying to produce a more efficient Australian economy.
Keating, if I'm not mistaken, Hawke and Keating won the election in 1983 with no suggestion of these policies, but it was the reality of the economic context in Australia which enabled them to change their mind. Am I right?
Pretty well. you could use that as a short version of a very long story.
Yeah. I mean, mugged by reality is even a shorter version. And I remember Keating's famous Banana Republic speech. If we don't change, we'll become a banana republic.
That was a bit later, but yes, that happened. And we're already on that track by then.
My question is, did the ALP believe in these economic policies in principle, or are they merely a pragmatic response to a particular crisis? And therefore, when the crisis seemed to have changed, gone away, you can go back to your old ways.
Well, the right wing of the Labor Party, it was split into two. I was on the right wing faction, both in Parliament and elsewhere. It was split in two. One remained statist and was led essentially by Beazley, but also Crean was of that orientation. Whereas the free market people in the right wing of the Labor Party, led by Keating, were seriously pursuing this as a principled objective.
So it wasn't that the whole party was merely pragmatic. There were genuine, deeply philosophical differences at the time.
Both within the right wing of the Labor Party and against the left wing of the Labor Party that never dropped its statist orientation.
In fact, you might say the statist is the more natural Labor view from the past history.
From 1901, indeed from 1891 when the party was founded, yes, it believed in statist intervention and still does.
Today?
Yes, of course.
Well, I want to come to that in a minute. How would you characterise the history that occurred since your book, since 04? At the time, if you told me, you can't possibly have known, because that's why they call the future by definition. Yeah. But now it's become the past. How would you, if you're writing another edition with another few chapters, how would you characterise the last 20 years?
Well, in 2004, when I wrote it, the predominant global orientation of economic policy in the capitalist countries was free market. It was led by the United States and was founded on what was known then as the Washington Consensus, which was a consensus coming out of Washington, both the American government and the agencies there, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on, was that countries should pursue more liberal economic structures, including reducing tariffs, reducing budget deficits, freeing up the labour market, freeing up the capital market, reducing restrictions on production and the movement of trade and goods, and so on. So I was writing in an environment where the global theories of liberalism were the Washington Consensus, liberalisation and globalisation of economies, so they would interlock and produce growth. And in 2004, that was happening. And of course, happened in Australia for decades to come. We had 30 years of pretty well uninterrupted growth and prosperity. Now, what occurred after 2004 that has changed the environment? Well, the big change was the 2008 Wall Street crash. That was a phenomenal event in the history of liberal capitalism. It was one of the biggest crashes in the history of capitalism, comparable with the 1930s, although its impact socially and so forth was not as great. And essentially what happened was the guys in Wall Street who run the show in the end got greedy and started selling themselves stuff that was worthless. And someone woke up to this sometime in 2008 and they stopped buying it. So the whole merry-go-round of global capitalism was growing into a halt because Wall Street had become unable to trade goods because nobody trusted them. Nobody trusted the value of the stuff they were selling.
Was this inevitable? Was this inevitable in a liberal economy?
Of course not. No. It was a grand fiddle by the Wall Street gangsters. They overreached themselves and weren't satisfied with the massive profits they were making and wanted even bigger ones. So led by the big trading houses of Wall Street, they got themselves in a massive trouble and needed and got a huge state bailout.
Yeah.
It varied from country to country. It was lesser in Australia, although it was probably still excessive. It was lesser here. It was greater in America. It was enormous in China. People tend to forget that. In the United Kingdom, it was a big bailout by Brown, who was then the Prime Minister. So free market capitalism had failed itself So the system that I was praising in 2004 fiddled itself into a crisis that was close to an existentialist crisis and got bailed out. It got bailed out in the United States by eventually Obama, although Bush was warming up to do that. Obama bailed them out. In the UK, it was a Labor government. In Australia, it was the Rudd Labor government. So this crisis really signalled the end of that glorious period of liberalism, globalisation, the Washington Consensus, and so on. And it was because the capitalists, the big boys in Wall Street, had wrecked the situation.
Would not a critic of liberalism be able to say, well, that's what you've got to expect. If you loosen the rules, you let the market run, you're going to get bad actors free to act, and therefore it's an inherent weakness in the system that will lead to these crises.
Well, I wouldn't dispute that. They're very greedy, the big capitalists. And in this, I'm sorry to use these expressions from my leftist past, no doubt, but that's how I saw it, and that's how most people saw it. And the result was not just a expansion of the state having to bail them out, but also a reaction against capitalism among the broad mass of the populations of the countries I've just enumerated. So people who in 2004-05, when I was producing that book, were relatively happy with capitalism, to the extent that they're ever going to be. And 2008, 9, 10, they got very, very unhappy with it. And not just the broad mass of the population, but political parties across the spectrum, and particularly the Social Democrat parties, who started to swing to the left, and mass movements, and I think it's fair to call them that, emerged in all the major countries against capitalism as such. In the United States, it was called Occupy Wall Street, and emerged politically eventually as Bernie Sanders in the Democrat Party. In the United Kingdom, I've forgotten what it was called, but the Labor Party swung greatly to the left and eventually produced Corbyn as a result. And the parties themselves started to be more interventionist in their perspective on the market economy. And in this country, of course, the Labor Party was in power and produced the most left-wing prime minister I think we've ever had, in Julia Gillard.
There you are. It took crisis in the late 70s to produce a liberalisation of the world economy, which then led to a crisis in the 2000s, I should say, which led to a challenge to it, a knocking it down. Will it need another crisis to get it back up again?
Well, I think we need just to say a few words about how it got out of the 2008-10
Please do.
Crisis. Let me say something about that. First of all, it led to a re-interventionist state in all these economies, much more so in America than previously, more so in the United Kingdom, a re-interventionist consensus among the political class in Australia, and similarly in the European countries, about which I say less because I know less. And the intervention took various forms: bigger state share, more taxation, more debt, hugely more debt, a use of the printing press to stimulate the economy so you got more inflation, and more immigration as a stimulus to the economy, which the political class always denied they wanted, but in all these countries introduced far more people. Immigration boomed as a stimulus to the economy. So this went on as economic policy, and in political policy, the guys in Wall Street realized that they were the bad guys. Everyone knew they were the bad guys in this situation, and so they moved to this posture of being the good guys. So what do? You can't allow Occupy Wall Street to go on forever. So they invented, or they didn't quite invent, but they reorganized the ideology which we now know as woke. So as a substitute for the radical youth, instead of Occupy Wall Street, how about Black Lives Matter? Transsexual policies are really good. How about diversity, equity, and inclusion as corporate policy? How about government, social and environment outcomes is important for corporates? How about 20 or 30 movies that have as their heroes the inventors of big Wall Street monopoly capitalist enterprises like Microsoft or Apple? I'm not sure if Musk has had a film biography yet, but he's probably due for one. So that far from being the enemies of the working class, the big corporates became their friends in favour of more social policies, better governance structures, more equity, and in favour of course, much more immigration, which was good for their market policies, but also became part of their social equity programs.
Do I detect, Bob, a tone of cynicism in your remarks at this point?
No, I'm not cynical about it at all. I could give you a chapter and verse.
No. What I mean is, were they really for the helping out the working class? Were they really trying to help, or was this basically a way to recover themselves?
Well, it was a way of covering themselves. They'd created the crime 2008-10, and this was a way of saying, we've reformed, we're new guys, look at us, aren't we wonderful, we're helping you, and so on. And in some respects, of course, they are, because capitalism does lead to improved standards of living, but it also has deficiencies. The other thing they got onto, and I can't let this go without mention, is global warming. Global warming was a kind of fringe ideology among climate scientists in the universities looking for Nobel Prizes or higher grants or whatever they were looking for. And after the financial crisis of 2008-10, they took it up as a serious mantra. In fact, they propagated it very widely. Now, why did they do this? Well, one of the causes of the 2008 meltdown had been that they'd invested particularly in the American housing market in order to find profitable outlets, because they perceived there to be a shortage of profitable investment opportunities. Now, global warming, when you put it into policy, was wonderful for investors. It destroyed vast systems of energy creation that used to provide cheap energy for industry and the masses and improve standards of living across populations, destroyed and required massive new investments in everything from rooftop solars to solar screens and windmills across the countryside to various other operations of energy generation and associated outcomes like electric bikes, electric cars, electric lorries, and so on. So this was creating a whole new industry of profitable investment. So you had the two things going on. One was, we're the good guys. The other is, oh, good, we've got new profitable outlets for investment.
You make it sound like they were being cynical and not serious.
No, some of them would believe in the global warming stuff. I mean, listen to Malcolm Turnbull any day of the week.
No, in other words, it wasn't just a cynical ploy, it was a genuine belief, but for many of such people.
Well, of course, it's good for Goldman Sachs, good for the planet.
I think you've kept some of your lefty tones under this one, Bob Catley. Bob Catley.
No, I'm just observing the way they carry on.
Well, I'll get back to my earlier question then. Your book describes very well how the crisis of the 70s led to the unexpected but understandable triumph of liberalism in Australia. You've now told a story where that's come under severe challenge because of the 2008 and 10 crisis. Will it require another crisis for liberalism to get back on to a more prominent position in Australia and the world? In other words, is it crises that change ideology?
Well, we've had two major crises over the last 3 or 4 years that have confronted the kind of more state intervention policies of the teams from 2010 2020. The first crisis was the COVID crisis, which led to another huge leap in government spending, government intervention, and regulation of the economy. So we've dispensed with the mild re-regulation of the teens, and we're now going into a new era of much more severe interventionism. The other is war. That over the last 2 years, the world of global capitalism, of liberalism, of democratic capitalism, which is, incidentally, I should make it quite clear, is my preferred method of governance of all those on show at the present time. I'm a supporter. I'm a critical supporter, but supporter nonetheless.
Yes.
And it's now being confronted with two major wars, one instigated by the Russians against Ukraine and strategically in the European theatre, and the other instigated by the Iran-led terrorist organizations in the Middle East against Israel, both Ukraine and Israel in various ways being allies of and supported by the United States and its allies. So we're now in a limited war situation that could at any time break into a more generalized war.
And this means more. This means more government intervention still further.
Absolutely. I mean, everyone's in favour of liberal capitalism until it's under threat, and it's now under quite serious strategic threat by non-capitalist states who would like to see it changed in a direction of greater intervention. They vary about the terms of this intervention and the crushing of liberalism, but they all know they're against it. They're against the form of liberalism that emerged in the teens, that incorporates all sorts of woke ideologies, but is at its core a philosophy of markets, private individuals, private decisions about investment, and the use of capital and so on. And they're against that. The Russians are against it in one way, Iran in another, North Korea in another, China in another, but they're all against it.
And they're at the moment doing better than the liberal states?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I mean, if you had to be an individual working person in any of these systems, it would be in ours.
So that does imply there's still a attractive resilience in liberalism.
Oh, of course. There's never been any question about that, but it also does depend on what side of the fence you're on. I mean, liberalism looks a lot better from the point of view of a retired person in South Australia than it does if you're digging the lithium out of the mines wherever they are in Africa.
Yes.
On 10 bob a day or whatever they're paying them this week. So it's a system that ranges quite widely and has benefits that differ area to area, person to person, and class to class.
But it works. But in the long run, does not a liberal market approach to economics and society actually produce greater wealth and greater well-being than the alternatives, even though they're intended to do the opposite?
That's generally my point of view. I mean, I think you can formulate a decent argument against it using the Chinese example of the last 40 or 50 years. But generally, I agree with what you say, that the most advanced form of economic organisation and production is the form of democratic capitalism that we experience. Yes.
Now, you're not a prophet. No one's a prophet. But
is that with an F or a PH?
A PH here. Do you have any sense of where this is going in the short and long term at this stage?
Well, in the immediate future, we've got to confront the possibility of war. There's no question about that, and I'm happy to concede that the Albanese government, although they didn't initiate it, have undertaken a serious program of getting a means of defending Australia. That is the nuclear submarine fleet, which could provide the basis of an independent national deterrence against anyone likely to attack us. So that's a good start. In other areas, probably the defence policy is more shabby. But that is why, in my view, that you'll get a reduction in the woke ideology of everything, anything goes, as the people that run these countries, particularly the United States, get used to the idea they've got to tighten up and get more patriotic and beef up for what could be a serious military confrontation with serious adversaries. So you'll see that the people that run Wall Street, who after all are the masters of this universe, have shifted a bit from the old doddery Biden and his funny social policies towards Trump. Trump isn't getting the whack around the head from the boys that run the country this time round.
Do you have any longer term? That's your short term. Although short term, nuclear submarines are not that short term. You and I may not live to see them. Who knows that? Both being old men in retirement, but we'll see about that. But what about longer term? Any hint? Any thought of will not liberalism re-emerge as it were refreshed again as it did in the 80s?
Well, once you get a bout of long-term prosperity, I think yes, it's a serious prospect.
No, I know. Isn't the other way around? If things go really bad, you think this is not working. Let's try the market again. If state intervention is not producing the wealth that people want, they may say, there was something we tried back last century. Let's try it again.
Well, underlying our discussions is the fact that the liberal economy has been maintained. It's the degree of intervention by the state that is at issue. Most of the serious economic and capital investment and technology decisions in the United States, the leading capitalist economy, are made privately. The state just hangs around and does the military stuff, or at least orders it, and then it's privately produced. It's still a privately controlled economy. The people that run the place, the 1% that Bernie Sanders was always on about, they're privately wealthy. I mean, Elon Musk, the Microsoft man, well, I've forgotten his name now. These guys are seriously wealthy and run large parts of the economy, not the state.
So really, liberalism in some form is still here.
Yeah, we're talking about levels of intervention into the economies. We're talking about levels of intervention. Australia had a much larger state system of intervention and control 40 years ago than it does now.
Even though the state control has come back in, the government leading thing, government spending money, government determining, or the conditioned investment is certainly returned in a way that wasn't here 10, 50, 20 years ago.
Yes, we're a more liberal economy now than we were when Hawke was elected in the early 1980s. But we're a less liberal economy, arguably a less liberal economy than when I wrote that book.
There you are. Well, it's come and it's not gone. It's come and just slightly declined. The surprising but understandable rise of liberalism in Australia.
Yes, liberalism as such doesn't carry the cachet that it did 30 years ago.
I'm Rob Forsyth. Thank you for watching.